Hello again to all of you. Um, I'm hoping that you have gone through the first video on memory, which is memory part 1, and I hope you've understood all the models of memory. Now, of course, this topic being really vast, I had to break it down into purely explaining the theories of memory first, and then focusing on the second aspect of memory, which is also extremely important but much shorter in nature, which is forgetting. So if I had to ask you, uh, what would it be like for you if you had to be able to remember every single thing from the very first breath of life? What would it be like if you hadn't forgotten anything, and to this date you have a memory of every single thing that has happened? I'm pretty sure it would be really crazy, overwhelming, and I think it would put people out of order. And it would be great to have such a phenomenal memory, but I think on the flip side, I mean, can you imagine, you would end up having a memory of every single thing. Probably it'll be really nice if you can remember every happy memory, but what about the ones that you don't really want to remember, or the ones you really want to push away, or the ones that still lie with you in your mind, in your heart, and they hurt you, they cause you pain? What about those? Right? And even the brain on the biological level and the mind at a psychological level do look at forgetting as a very essential part of memory. So let's take a look at how we break down this simple concept. All right, you see a picture there with uh, an eraser erasing certain portion of the brain. So we're going to look at a little bit on the introduction and the nature of forgetting. So definitely forgetting is a mental process, just like memory, right? And we sort of have to look at um, how this process works. What are the causes? What are the theories? And what are the different studies that people did on this topic in terms of experiments? And we must understand that when there is learning, there will be forgetting. Now, why would someone say so? Why would someone say something like this? Because I think if I have to take you back to what we covered initially in our first video on learning, I think you remember how I explained that when you learn something, there's a permanent change in the brain. That is because a memory is formed from what you've learned. So if a memory is formed, at some point there are going to be situations where you may not use that learning and that information, that experience, and therefore forgetting will occur. Right? Forgetting is also called as the inability to retain information or retrieve information. Retain is to sustain and let information stay. And retrieve is to be able to recall or bring back into consciousness and use information in the present. So, as we live, we experience many things, and from each of them we sort of gain a lot of impressions. But after a certain period of time, parts of these impressions are forgotten. Either they fade, either they decay, either it's inability to remember them. And this process of fading or not being able to recall is called forgetting. So, definitely, a person selects certain things to remember and forgets other things in order of priority, right? It If we're looking at a person prioritizing some things in his mind and wants to remember some things, it is obvious that some things which are not the priority will either be stored for a long period of time and not used, which eventually may be forgotten. Which brings us to the next point, that is, forgetting occurs usually in the initial stage of learning. Now, why am I talking about this in this manner? Why am I saying that it occurs in the initial stage of learning? Because when you're learning something new, the memory trace is not formed yet, and it's forming, it's in the formation stage. And at that point, it's really weak. You remember we saw this thread-like structure in the previous video on memory, that the longer the person rehearses, the stronger the memory trace becomes. So initially, when you're learning any skill, forgetting is maximum, and which is why you need to keep revising, right? But if you have understood the meaning of what you are learning, be it a skill, be it something related to academics, be it just something that you're exploring, maybe a route, if you're able to assign enough meaning to the learnt material, forgetting will decrease. So that's the next point which is flashing here. Forgetting decreases as the meaning of learned material increases. So, very rightly, we can say that the depth of that impression of anything that you're learning depends on the learner's understanding of the subject matter. So, if proper understanding of the learning material occurs, then it stays for a longer period of time in the mind, and it also can be recalled easily. But on the other hand, half learned information and just sort of going through subject matter can cause forgetting. Right? Okay. The next point is failure during recall is what is forgetting. That when you're trying to recall something and you're unable to, that is what we're looking at as forgetting, or while performing a previously learned action. In the present, if you're trying to probably start swimming after a really long time, but you've not really aced the skill, you've just learned, there was not enough amount of practice, and maybe because of the winters you've taken a break, you go back by February, for example, and you get into the pool, you might take some time to bring back those skills. So if you sort of have errors while performing a previously learned skill or an action, there is some amount of forgetting that has taken place. So psychologists generally use the term forgetting as some loss of information which was already stored in the long-term memory. So when we say that we've forgotten something, it means that our memory doesn't match with the events that have occurred. Right? The reason is it may not have reached, sometimes what we've learned may not have reached the long-term memory, or there might be lack of rehearsal. So we are going to look at some basic theories and some recent theories of forgetting to understand both ways, either the causes of forgetting or a few experiments and studies done on forgetting, which have then given us a deeper understanding of what forgetting is all about, right? So this takes us to the main topics that we're going to cover today. Take a look at all of them, and I won't be reading it out. We will be covering them one by one. So we have about 7 topics, after which I will quickly run you through one of the most famous experiments and studies done on forgetting. So the first one is called as neural decay or memory trace decay or decay through disuse theory. It's one of the oldest theories of forgetting, right? According to this view, firstly we're looking at a memory trace, which is a structure, right? And according to this view, this structure, this physical imprint that forms in the brain, sort of fades away. So it either fades or it decays over a period of time. Sometimes it will fade gradually, sometimes it might completely disappear. So we're looking at a physical change, right? I remember I told you that even when we covered learning, I told you that whenever you learn something, a physical imprint is formed in the mind, and that is because a memory is being formed. There is a change in the structure of some neurons, and that trace is called as an engram. Now, which part of the brain is essentially responsible for the creation of memories? It's the hippocampus. And there are many other brain parts involved, but this is the main brain area responsible for the creation of long-term memories. Now, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about the biological, the neurological aspect, right? Because we need to take a look at this theory through that angle. So if I'm talking about neural decay, I'm talking about neurons, decay in the neurons, right? So a lot of studies have stated that an engram is not just a physical change, but there are many physical changes in the sensitivity of neurons, in the dendrites, in the proteins, everything. And what happens is this memory trace has this physical quality, right? So this theory suggests that memory traces should be kept functioning, otherwise they may vanish. And this physical quality of the memory trace can keep changing over a period of time. So if you've not used or some memories have not really reminded you of anything, it's just staying there, right? And if it just stays there for a really long period of time, even the physical quality starts fading. You can look at it like color, right? Like paint, and how paint starts chipping and fading. Even the texture changes, even the richness of the color changes, and over a period of time it just is not that color and that feel anymore. That's how a memory trace is. Yeah, so a lot of research suggests that the brain synapses affect in how they hold information together for a long period of time. So a memory trace has 2 physical qualities, right? The first quality is the strength, which is maximum after learning, right? The strength of the trace is maximum after learning, and in terms of rehearsal and in terms of revising that again and again and putting it to use. But it will decline over a period of time. And the second quality is the resistance to disappear, which means if the trace has managed to survive and it's really strong, all right, and it is probably not subjected to fading, it would last longer, right? So that brings us to the next point, which means that why do they fade over a period of time? Because there are organic changes in the brain. And this fading away can be looked at from two concepts, decay and disuse, right? Decay, if you remember, happens in the sensory memory or short-term memory, right? You remember we spoke about displacement in short-term memory because there's so much of information coming in that all the old input has to be replaced and it has to be pushed out. So if it's not used, obviously it'll either get displaced or it'll decay. Decay is when you don't use something for a long period of time, like a fruit. It'll fade and it'll rot, and it's useless after a period of time. And if we're looking at disuse, it's pretty obvious and self-explanatory. We're looking at the fact that if we don't use a memory for a long period of time, or the memory doesn't remind us of something new in the long-term memory, then it fades away, right? So if you would like a better explanation for this, then for disuse and decay, then I would say that decay is a sort of loss in memory due to a period of time. So this trace has not been used over a period of time. Disuse is also another name for decay, wherein we're looking at memories that are not used will eventually disappear. Yeah, so that's how we're going to look at it. Use it or lose it. So if you don't use them, they will start fading and you will probably lose them from your long-term memory. Which brings us to, this is not really found in a lot of books, but yes, I stumbled upon what it is called, something like leaky bucket hypothesis. So what is this leaky bucket hypothesis? That the trace will begin to fade or disappear entirely over a period of time. So it's like a leaky bucket. Water keeps on dripping till the point that if it's obviously not used or nothing is done about kind of keeping the water intact, everything will just fade away. And this is due to not using it. So it's due to disuse. So if we do not keep our memory traces functional and we do not keep using them, they will vanish. So if we're looking at an example, details of events are lost over a period of time due to disuse, which is why they then decay. So if you're looking at your first birthday party, which I'm sure you do not remember much about, or your third or your fourth, where you have just glimpses and flashes of what you were wearing or which friends were around, but you don't really remember the event completely with all the details. And that's because maybe you weren't in the habit of really going back and remembering that event at all. So what happens over a period of time? You've not used that memory much to talk about it with friends or to remind yourself of how such a happy moment that was, that there was disuse. And now today, maybe if I ask you this question while you're watching the video, you can probably very strongly say yes, that I think those memories have decayed and I think they've sort of faded. They're there, but I can't really bring them to my consciousness, right? And from this theory, we're also going to look at two very important topics called as amnesia. What is amnesia? Amnesia is loss, memory loss, right? I'm sure you've come across these words before, but in terms of understanding the meaning. So these two are forms of severe loss of memory, right? And let's look at the first one, retrograde amnesia. Okay, so if we have to look at a person who has met with a severe accident and who has sustained injuries to the head and the neck, which and the back, which is your nervous system, uh, we can understand that maybe that person is unable to recall the accident itself, and sometimes would probably not be able to remember stuff that happened before the accident. So we are looking at a loss of memory from before the injury. That is retrograde amnesia. Retro means something from the past, right? So it's a loss of memory from the point of accident or injury backwards. So to put it in the simplest of words, loss of memory for the past events. So everything before the accident sort of is either faded, wiped out, or distorted and does not make sense. That's retrograde amnesia, right? If we have to look at anterograde amnesia, anterograde is obviously forward. So it's loss of memories or the inability to form memories and then remember them from the point of injury onwards. So basically, simple words, difficulty remembering anything new, right? A lot of patients of anterograde amnesia tend to have more difficulty than people with retrograde amnesia, because people with the former type of amnesia are still able to form new memories. So they can still relearn a lot of new things. But people with anterograde amnesia uh, also tend to have a lot of mood issues in terms of not being able to do a lot of things and in terms of the helplessness that they face. So sometimes people may not remember that they've already had their medication, and they might end up taking one more, two more doses of it, because everything after a certain point of time is sort of does not register as memories in the long term or the short term. So that's anterograde amnesia, not being able to form memories or utilize any memory that is formed um, after probably an accident or an injury, right? So yeah, so this is how I would like to sum up this theory in short. uh, in a way which we must understand that memory overall we cannot say has a limited capacity, but it has limits to recall, right? Our long-term memory may be uh, unlimited, but our ability to recall things is limited. So rehearsal will definitely prevent decay and keep material active in the memory. But if individuals stop rehearsing, stop using skills, become lazy, just work all day, not utilize a lot of their talents, a lot of skills also can decay. And skills are related to memories, because memories are related to learning. So you see how all this is interconnected. So but we must also understand that this theory sort of is cannot completely explain uh, forgetting, because here we're only looking at the biological traces fading over a period of time. So forgetting does not seem to occur only because of disuse. I'm sure there are other factors that influence memories that are stored. So this theory provides limited support for forgetting, which is why we're going to look at a few more theories of forgetting. Okay. Now this brings us to the um, next theory, which is trace distortion theory. Now distortion, what is distortion? I'm going to show you a picture. This is a picture of a visual from a patient's mind under the influence of cocaine, right? So forget about the theory right now. If I'm talking about somebody under the influence of a drug, pretty much everything he looks at is sort of a modified reality, right? People do see and experience things beyond just their normal capacities when they're under the influence of a drug. And this is how it looks like. Look at the picture, right? The stairs is what is causing the distortion. People climbing up, someone climbing down, on the other side of the stairs someone is climbing down, and on the same side above someone is climbing up. So this is distortion. I'm just trying to explain the meaning of distortion to you. Distortion is something which is something amiss, something is not okay. So when we're looking at trace distortion or memory trace distortion, what are we looking at then? What are we really trying to talk about? So this theory suggests that memory traces gradually change with time. So we're looking at change as the distortion. The word distortion would mean changing over time, not because of fading, but because of distortion, right? There was a very famous British psychologist, Bartlett, who examined and studied distorted memories. And it was found that during recall, a lot of details about objects are forgotten, and the richness of all those details is lost. So when if I'm asking you to reproduce a few visual details of something that you maybe a trip or an old trip that you probably visited a really nice place, and I'm asking you to sort of reproduce it in detail with a lot of feeling and emotion and a lot of visuals, some features you are just not able to reproduce in words. It's sort of there, but you're not very sure if it was a mountain, if it was a rock, how green it was, whether it was dense, but you have this blurred sort of memory of it. So some features are not easily clear, they're not very clear, and which means that they're lost, and it's a less detailed form of explanation, right? So when you put this explanation together, a great deal of forgetting is possible because we tend to condense information that is very old or very complex information. So that is the third point which is on the screen, that forgetting details of topics because we condense complex material. So what is complex material? Details are complex, right? And if I have to tell you to try to recall every single thing that you saw when you went for maybe a trek or camping, the beauty of it cannot be defined in words completely to the point of precision, because there are so many things that you saw that day. So this is complex material, and what all humans do while reporting something that's very detailed is we start condensing is trying to compile all the smaller bits of information into one sentence. So what you're trying to do is you're not really summarizing, you're doing that because you've probably forgotten some details of that event, right? So it is safe to say that you're summarizing, but it's a reality that we don't remember a lot of things that we see and experience. And when we don't remember and we're asked to deliver details, we talk about a few important details that we do remember. And why? Because we've condensed the most important things that we saw, and we've sort of let the rest just sort of blend with the most important things. So this is a form of distortion, right? you are not exactly reproducing what you saw. You're condensing it, you're blending it, you're giving me like an overall summary of it. So if I have to tell you, try to remember the details of a picture, a movie, or a story that you have seen, read, or watched in the theater. You would not be able to, even if you watch like the latest movie that I watched was Justice League, right? And I remember everything. I remember the plot, I remember the theme, I remember the characters, I remember what the whole thing was about, but I definitely don't remember every detail. So what I do when I have to report to someone who's not watched the movie, I sort of have the freedom to manipulate information and just sort of summarize it, put it in an abstract. And what am I doing? I'm morphing information, right? I am condensing information. I'm distorting information. So this is what trace distortion theory talks about. It's not perceiving original information accurately, or you might have perceived the first experience accurately, but you're not able to reproduce it in the same manner. So that is trace distortion, right? Because of a simple understanding that some features or some details are lost because we are not able to gather and compile all kinds of complex information. So there will be an error in your perception, and there will be distortion of memory when you're reproducing a story to somebody but you're not able to with complete detail, right? So a great deal of forgetting happens due to this reason, and our traces, our memory traces become distorted. They are not what we originally experienced, which we must understand that this is not something negative, but this is just how the mind works, and also how the brain works, because we're also looking traces, right? Traces are biological. So they're just like cells. They die out, they wear out, the strength starts reducing over a period of time. Now let's look at the next theory, which is the encoding, storage, and retrieval failure theory. Now this is a very, very simple theory in and by itself, right? For encoding failure, we're definitely looking at how information does not get encoded in the first place. So you remember, if you have to definitely watch this video after watching part 1, right? Because a lot of jargon that I'm going to be using is from that video. So if I'm talking about encoding failure, right, let's break this whole thing down into first just encoding failure. There are several reasons why people forget things, and the simplest of that is that sometimes things just don't get encoded in the first place. So for example, there are children sitting in a class, a teacher is saying something, okay, and the children have heard it, but they've not really paid attention to what the teacher has said. They know that the teacher has said something, but they don't know what. And then they'll start talking and they'll be like, yeah, what did the teacher say, and what are we supposed to do? Is it about homework? Is it about, like a period running short? Are we leaving early? What is it? Because this information passed on through your sensory memory, but not completely. So this failure in not passing correct information through because of not paying enough attention is called as encoding failure. It's failure to process information into the memory itself, right? Because of less attention. So I can give you a very simple example that if I have to ask you to tell me every single shop that you that is physically present from the time you leave home till the first left or right turn that you take to wherever you're going every day, would you be able to reproduce every single name to me? It's not possible, right? In fact, even if I have to tell you that the route that you take every day to go to work and come back, how many vegetable vendors do you see on the way? This is simply because we do not pay attention to a lot of things. So a lot of information in the bargain does not get encoded in the first place. So that is encoding failure, which then brings us to storage failure. Now, storage failure means the material got encoded, but it did not get transferred to LTM because of poor rehearsal. Right? Now, this is taking us back to the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, that if there is not enough of rehearsal, maybe if there's just a little bit, that's maintenance rehearsal for it to get stored only in the short-term memory, which also gets wiped out after a period of time. But if material has not been rehearsed enough, which is elaborative rehearsal, it will not get transferred to LTM, which is the storage failure. So sensory memory and short-term memory anyway have poor storage capacity. So you might have to rehearse a little bit, but it will stay for a short period of time. As simple as you're learning certain things for your exam and you just have to vomit it out the next day. That's a very simple example of short-term memory storage. Right? Because you're storing it for a certain period of time, and it's definitely within the short-term memory, which again has a short capacity for storing information. Now, what can be another reason for storage failure? Which is the last point that you can currently see on the screen. Information does not get encoded properly, and therefore efficient memory creation becomes difficult. So storage gets affected. So again, that brings us to encoding failure itself, that if you are not able to encode information, not at all, but if you're not able to encode information properly, then a correct memory or a very clear memory creation is not possible, which then affects the storage of that memory. Then probably that memory is not very strong. Right? Also, we have to understand that if a stimulus material, okay, has a lot of sensory details to it, so different sensory details would be stored in different parts of the brain, right? So suppose I ask you to recall all those details right now. Maybe every detail may not be accessible to you at this point. So in memory disorders, or when a person succumbs to a brain injury, damage to different areas of the brain can result in storage failure. So there is a breakdown in the storage system itself, which is a cause of forgetting, which can explain forgetting. And let's look at the last part, which is retrieval failure. So retrieval means inability to recall information. But why? Because of lack of retrieval cues. Now, what is a cue? A cue is a clue, a hint. Right? Now, let me explain this to you very, very clearly. When we are not very, very consciously, but at some conscious level, creating a memory for something, we just don't remember that event in exclusion. We do remember the environment in which it happened, the people sort of who were around when it happened, what kind of, was it day or was it night? Was it cold or was it hot? We do remember environmental cues when we are experiencing something, and when a memory for that experience has been formed. Okay, but if I have to ask you to recall, let's just go back to the same example, your first birthday. You might just, maybe you're just having a false memory and you're trying to tell me, oh, my first birthday cake was like white in color and it had a candle which was in the form of a shape of 1, and it was lit, and everybody, you're creating this. Obviously probably it's a false memory, because I'm sure you don't remember how your first birthday was like, but yes, that's all you would probably be able to remember. Why can't you remember the rest of it? Because you're not able to remember the clues on that event. So you're not able to remember who sang for you. You're probably not able to remember the amount of relatives that may have come to celebrate this day. Yeah, so that is lack of retrieval cues. Okay, and sometimes access to that memory becomes difficult because we don't have enough cues. So it's as simple as if you are looking at going to a library and you're looking for a book. It doesn't mean that the book doesn't exist. It's because you don't know where it is. You don't know the cues. You don't know which letter it starts from, what is the book code according to the librarian or the organization in the library. You probably don't know which section it comes under. Is it like a fictional book? Is it non-fictional? Is it what kind is it? Is it teenage fiction? So these cues are sort of absent or sort of unavailable. So access to that book itself has already become difficult. It's the same with memories. So retrieval failure, the theory retrieval failure, would depend on retrieval cues. Now we have external cues and internal cues, right? Now before I take you through those aspects, we have to understand that sometimes most of the times when we store a new memory, we store information about the environment about that memory also. So what happens if you've had like a beautiful experience in Paris? It's not the experience that you remember. It's that place and it's that environment which acts as a hint, and then that whole scene of Paris flashes. So the next time you're in Paris, it's the environment that reminds you of the experience you've had over there. That's how I would summarize it for you. So information from the LTM will be able to be retrieved if there is appropriate retrieval cue present at that point of time. Okay, but now let's look at external and internal cues right now. Okay, external cues are environmental cues. Everything which talks about the smell of something or the place, or whether it was day or night, was it during school, was it during college. So these cues help in retrieval, right? And if you have context, which is environmental hints, then you're able to remember the situation very well. But what are internal cues? Internal cues are cues inside the individual, which can be mood, which can be emotion, which can be a physical state. So if I have to talk to you about an accident and try to talk about it, I tell you to talk about it, you're going to remember the mood, you're going to remember your emotion, you're going to remember how painful it was, you're going to remember your physical state, right? You're going to remember your psychological state. So all this information about the current mood in which that trace was stored is what is going to act as a cue, right? So if I have to say that when a person is encoding information while that person is drunk, that person is more likely to recall that same incident when he's drunk the next time rather than when he's sober. So if he had like if he blurted out some really bad secrets about himself when he was drunk, the next time somebody asks him, like, what was it like the last time you were drunk? That drinking itself is a cue, because that state of being completely disoriented and then blurting out all your secrets, that becomes a cue to then reproduce that event and tell a friend that, it was so funny. So we have to understand that these cues play a very important role in reproducing information. So lack of access or to retrieval cues could be due to a lot of reasons. It could be poor organization of information, poor memory, not reviewing and rehearsing information a lot, maybe due to anxiety, stress, feeling extremely moody. All these are internal cues, right? And when we don't have enough cues, we don't have enough hints, sometimes we're unable to recall an event. So this is about encoding, storage, and retrieval failure. Now let's look at the next theory, which is lack of consolidation theory. Now first we need to definitely understand what is this consolidation. right? And I'm sure you have not really come across this topic much, because not a lot of theorists under studying this topic have really done research for this as a cause of forgetting. Okay, now we have to understand that when we are looking at this theory, uh, a lot of people argued that forgetting happens due to this theory precisely. Now, what is consolidation? It is a process which fixes information in the long term memory. So, it is that period of time. Okay, you have to imagine that there is information getting passed on from the short term memory to the long term memory, and that in between time is the time where information or memories are being formed. Information is changing in a way to become stronger and get transferred to the long term. So that period in between is the process of consolidation. And consolidation takes time. It takes hours, it can take days, depending on what the mind is trying to transfer. I hope this is clear, right? Which brings us to the next point, that during this period between when information is passing on from short-term memory to long. Now, how will you look at it? You can look at it at two railway stations and a train passing from the first railway station to the next. So your STM is your one railway station, your LTM is the next destination, and the journey in between is when the memories are traveling. Now, this obviously can take hours and days, right? Because it takes time for a train to move. Okay, and during this period there are a lot of changes in the nervous system, because new information is whatever the new information that has come in is being rehearsed, it's being modified, and it's being sent into long-term storage for some future use. So obviously, why are we saying changes in nervous system? Because we understand that when memories are being formed or they're being transferred, memory traces are formed in the brain. So there are physical changes in the organic changes in the nervous system. Now, when there are organic changes, we have to connect it immediately to neurons, right? And we are also saying that there is a modification of neurons. There's a change in the shape of the neurons or the activity of the neurons to form permanent memories. And that entire process, that journey, that travel between station A to station B is the process of consolidation. So if you have to precisely put it in words, in very simple words, I would say that consolidation is the change that takes place in the structure and the functioning of the neurons when memories are being transferred to the long-term storage. So when permanent memories are being formed, a lot of neurons keep changing, and this takes time. Please don't think of this as a very mechanical process, that there is something that's entering the sensory register, it then enters the short term, then it enters the long term. No, that's not how it works, right? When you take a nap, everything that you study the night before sort of gets processed, and it is slowly traveling to the long term so that you can remember that information for a period of time. And that process is called the process of consolidation. Now we have understood what consolidation is. Now we have to look at how lack of consolidation causes forgetting. Now, where are we going to look at that? Okay, so how we are going to understand this is that recently formed memories are more prone to forgetting as they're still being consolidated. So what happens, that in that journey between station A and B, those memories are traveling, right? Why are they? That's what the word says, that recently formed memories. These are the recently formed memories. They're traveling to the long term. They haven't reached there yet. So they're still in the formation stage. They are more prone to forgetting because they are in the consolidation process. Now, what happens in the consolidation process brings us to the next point. While these memories are being formed into permanent memories, you are still experiencing life. You're still conscious. So there is new information passing in through your sensory registers that can interfere with this process and cause forgetting. So it's as simple as looking at it like this, that the train is carrying a certain number of people between station A and B. There are no real stops, but sometimes a train takes halts. New passengers sometimes just pop in to the train between A and B. They've not popped in through a proper railway platform, they've popped in from in between. That is your new information popping in. And that new information or those new people interfere with the number of people who are already seated, the passengers who have reserved seats. So that kind of leads to a little disturbance. So by the time those people who have reserved seats end up probably cramping their seat and allowing more people to sit with them, five people on one entire patch of whatever that seating arrangement is, that bench. So you can understand how there is a disturbance there in the formation of those memories. And that's why it is during this process that if consolidation gets affected or reduces, which means a lack of consolidation, then those memories are prone to forgetting or not being formed properly. This is the lack of consolidation theory, and I really hope that I have been able to explain this to you very well, because this is the only example that I could look at and explain this to you. So just understand that when new information is being taken in, there are already some memories which are getting processed into long term. If that new information reaches fast enough to trouble those memories, the process that they're going through, that is consolidation, it disturbs that process. So that information does not get recorded properly into the long term, which means that the modification of neurons also gets disturbed. So these memories are most prone to interference and therefore forgetting. So I hope this is very clear to you, and let's move on to the next. Now in this theory, we have already looked at this concept of displacement when we spoke about short-term storage, and we understand that short-term storage has a very limited capacity. So there's a lack of space over there. And what ends up happening with this lack of space, that when old information, some information has come in, it gets stored, it occupies some space, but it becomes old as and when new information comes in again. So what happens is that old information gets pushed out to accommodate new information, right? And this pushing out of old information is displacement of old information. So displacement, this theory will explain forgetting in terms of short-term memory, okay, because lack of space, lack of availability in the short term. Okay, so we have to understand that short term can hold only small amount of information because of its 7 plus 2 minus 2 capacity, and when it is full, it pushes out old information. So old information is displaced and forgotten. Right now, there was a study, or rather like an experiment done by Murdoch called as free recall, in which participants had to listen to a list of words read out at a very steady pace, like 2 seconds per word, and they were asked to recall as many words as possible in any order, which means free recall, right? Now, when he came to the conclusion of this study, he understood that when each item was taken and the probability of these participants recalling was calculated, he sort of understood that there was a serial position curve that was formed. So what is the serial position curve? Serial is 1 by 1, right? So from this experiment of where they had to reproduce as many words as possible, he kind of noticed that participants had really good recall of items which appeared in the first beginning of the list, and a really good recall of items or of words at the end of the list. This is called as the primacy effect, that is good recall for words in the beginning of the list, and recency effect, that is good recall of words at the end of the list. So the first words on the list are obviously remembered easily because that's the first time they were read and there were no other words which were interfering with them. Then slowly there were many words in between. So the middle part of the list is where disturbance took place in the STM, because some old words had to get pushed out, these had to be put in again, and they had to be displaced. And then again the last few 3-4 words of the list again did not get, there was no competition with any other words because those were the last words on the list, so there was no interference, there was no more new information coming to push those last few words out of the STM. So they were again available very clearly for recall, right? So this is the serial position curve wherein Murdoch said that forgetting does happen due to displacement because new information is constantly coming in, but how he studied it is through giving these words a shot. So let's put this into words that we tend to remember the first inputs and the last few inputs of anything, of an experience, the best. So if we've gone for a trip, we'll always remember the first few things that, you know, when we were packing and we had to wake up in the middle of the night and sort of put everything in the car. We were all sleepy, but it was amazing. By the time the sun started rising, we stopped for breakfast. We remember these details very well. And whatever happens in between, we also sort of remember. And again we remember very strongly the last part of the trip, right? And this can be explained through the displacement theory, right? So I hope this is very clear. It's very simple. So let's move on. Okay, now we are going to look at the interference theory. Now this is something that you will find in a lot of textbooks, and probably you will have to definitely cover this when you're studying the concept of forgetting. So don't just look at the figure right now. Let's look at a few points to understand what interference is about, right? Interference is the influence of new information on old information, that is encoded information. So new information is coming in, it's interfering with the older information, right? Simple to understand. Okay, this influence of new information on the old information is not a good influence. We're looking at an adverse influence. So why are we saying adverse? Because it causes interference in retrieval. So if I tell you that, you know, learn 5 words that are all from S, 5-letter words all from S on the first day, and I give you another set of 5-letter words starting from S on the next day, there will be some words which you will mostly write from the second day than the first. Why? Because you might have a less stronger memory for the words you learned on the first day than the second, because the second day words influenced the first words in a negative way, because it caused interference. Which brings us to the third point, that recall is something that gets hampered due to this interference. But what is this interference theory? There are 2 types that we're going to look at: proactive interference and retroactive interference. Proactive is very simple. Let's put it in very simple words. Proactive interference is when old information interferes with new information, right? So if I have to explain this to you, how am I going to look at it? Okay, if you look at this example here, look at the proactive interference. Look at the side on the right, right? You know that there is a girl by the name of Julie. There's this new girl who's joined in class, and you learn her name. You learn her name very well, and you make friends with her. Then there's another girl who comes in after a week or 2, and her name is Judy. You learn that name as well. But you like Judy more, and you start hanging out with her more, but you end up calling her Julie, Julie, Julie again and again. Why? Because the material that was previously learnt interferes with the material that you recently learnt. That is called as proactive interference. So proactive interference sort of moves in a forward manner. Okay, as simple as when you get a new cell phone number, you will still tend to give out your old cell phone number because the trace of that memory is still very strong. Okay, so it's when older information prevents or interferes with learning and retrieval of new information, right? Correct. So let's look at the second topic, which is retroactive interference over here. It's when new information interferes with old information. It's the other way around. So for example, you've obviously learned the name of Julie first, and then comes this new girl Judy who you befriend, and that learning, that second learning is so good that when you go back and speak to Julie, you end up calling her Judy. That's retroactive interference. Retro is kind of moving backwards. So it's a retrieval problem that occurs when new information prevents with retrieval or interferes with the retrieval and learning of old information. So students generally who study similar information at the same time often experience this kind of interference. So if you're studying two languages at the same time, like Hindi, Marathi, sometimes if your Marathi paper was first and your Hindi paper is after one day, in your Hindi paper, you might use Marathi words. That's proactive interference. But if your Hindi is stronger, then you might end up using more Hindi words in your Marathi paper, right? Because already Hindi is probably your mother tongue. So even if your first paper is Marathi, maybe you're thinking in your mother tongue, which is Hindi language, so you end up using a lot of Hindi words. So that is how like new information interferes with old information. So let me give you a very common example of people driving, right? When people move out of India and they move to any other Western country where they drive on the left side, not on the right side, right? People drive on the right. So what tends to happen is that there's actually a little mixture of both. So you're sitting on the left side of the car, correct? But while you're driving, you drive on the right instead of the left side of the road. So research suggests that the greater the similarity in two sets of material to be learned, greater the degree of interference between them. So that is interference all in all. So let me just show this diagram here. If I tell you to learn a list A first, right, and then I tell you to learn list B, and then I tell you like, come on, produce the words of list A first, you're going to give me words from list B because you've learned list B recently and that new learning has affected the words from list A, from the old learning. So that's retroactive, right? You have a memory loss or slightly memory problem for the list A. That's retroactive interference. But if we're looking at proactive interference, we're looking at the other way around. You've learned list A, then you learn list B in the same order of events. But then I ask you, come on, tell me some words from list B. You might end up using words from list A. So old information interferes with new information. So there's a memory loss for list B. So that's proactive interference. I hope this is very clear. Again, it's simple. It can sound a little confusing, but you can very well kind of control this if you understand the semantic meaning of these words. Retro is works backwards. Proactive is the interference which works forward. So old affecting new is proactive. New information affecting old is retroactive. Okay, let's look at the last theory, which is called as motivated forgetting. Okay, now motivated forgetting in itself means that the person is motivated to forget something, right? So let's look at the first part. What are you motivated to forget? Definitely unpleasant memory, something that you don't want to remember at all, something embarrassing that you said when you were really drunk. Unpleasant memory coming from an unpleasant experience. So people want to forget these memories and they're motivated to forget them, or they are unable to retrieve them to consciousness. So they purposely block those memories in sort of a way that they don't have to remember them again. So a lot of motivated forgetting in a way is also very good, because sometimes people don't want to remember some things that have happened in their lives, probably which are very drastic and negative, and they want to store it away in some dark corner of their consciousness, right? So mostly this kind of forgetting happens with a lot of unpleasant things. So this brings us to the psychoanalytical part of forgetting, okay, which we're talking about repression, which is associated with repressed memories. What are repressed memories? Memories which are sort of pushed away, far away into storage, and it's not easy to recall them back because they're either too scary or either too negative in nature. For some examples could be traumatic events, terror, accidents, abuse, loss, war, etc. So it's mostly, we look at motivated forgetting as a psychological defense mechanism, right, where people forget unwanted memories either consciously or subconsciously. So there are times that we are reminded of unpleasant things and they make us angry, they make us anxious, afraid, and in these times we want to purposely forget these things and not be able to recall them into our consciousness. So it's a method where we can protect ourselves by blocking such information and putting them away, because they cause anxiety, or probably they're threatening to our current state. And usually these memories can be retrieved through hypnosis or other forms of therapy, right? Now this theory sort of came from Freud's analysis and some of his contemporaries, where Freud suggested that people usually have no perfect memory for traumatic events or things which are unpleasant, right? And so a person will really try to, or probably will end up forgetting a doctor's appointment because he really fears the doctor, or he really fears knowing what will come in the report. So he'll probably forget to go and collect the report. So there's a lot of evidence that memories that trouble us or that are traumatic might be pushed away for a basic defense mechanism. So the first thing that we're looking at here is repression. Repression is pushing away memories unconsciously or subconsciously, right? Because they're extremely unpleasant and they could be shameful, they could be extremely threatening, and they could disturb us if these things come into consciousness. So this thing was developed around 1915, the concept of repression, while Freud was studying psychoanalysis, right? And it's those times when we can't cope with things and we want to push them away. It's a defense mechanism, right? Now what is suppression? Suppression is also a sort of pushing away of material, but it's a conscious form of pushing away of material from the consciousness. So it's intentional, it's directed forgetting, right? So we are looking at directed forgetting over here. Now motivated forgetting is also one of the oldest theories of forgetting, because it's easy to understand why some people would not want to remember certain types of information. So we are looking at repression being pushing away information subconsciously and right into the unconscious, and suppression being more goal directed, which includes conscious attempts to forget something, right? So if you really do not want to think that, oh god, there's an exam tomorrow and I really don't want to think about it, you'll probably just push it away and do something else to make yourself feel better. That is sort of suppression. Okay, now where do these fear memories and all get stored? In the hippocampus, in the amygdala, in the prefrontal cortex. So these areas tend to sort of uh, function in order to stop recollecting these type of memories, so that the subject does not feel disturbed. So motivated forgetting has been a crucial aspect of understanding traumatizing experiences like rape, torture, natural disasters, right? So motivated forgetting is very high during wartime, especially due to factors associated with difficulties such as not having enough food or shell shock. Also, in abuse, many cases of motivated forgetting can be understood in terms of not wanting to remember childhood abuse or really having a bad childhood. So, that's how we can understand motivated forgetting theory, right? And this brings us to the last but very, very important part about Ebbinghaus and the forgetting curve. I'm sure all of you have sort of at least touched upon this topic somewhere under the realm of psychology, right? So Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist who first studied memory as a simple cognitive function, right? And he said that the speed of forgetting depends on a number of factors like difficulty of the material, a representation of the material, maybe the material is not meaningful enough. So obviously also, and between person to person, the forgetting rate would differ, right? So he did an experiment with first with nonsense syllables, and he experimented obviously on himself, right? Because he wanted to study forgetting. And what did he use? What is nonsense syllables? Syllables are all your letters and your sounds, and nonsense would obviously mean something that does not make sense. So he would not use words like cat or dog because they completely make sense, but he would use random combinations like CDJ, that's a CCC trigram, or a CVC would be a consonant vowel consonant. So maybe like TAY, but again TAY would closely relate to TOY, which is toy. So again he would not use something like that. So what he did was he made these combinations and he used meaningless items which could not be associated with some kind of prior learning, and they were used to study memory and forgetting. So he administered 2300 syllables of these kind of trigrams. Now he obviously conducted this experiment on himself, and what he noticed is that he had to memorize groups of 7 to 36 syllables altogether, and he measured his capacity to relearn this list of words after certain periods of time. So when he tried to sort of recall this list, he noticed that forgetting occurred in a very systematic manner. So initially, the reproduction of material was very strong. Like if I'm learning something in this very instance, in the next moment, my reproduction is probably precise. But immediately in 1 hour, forgetting was maximum. And then in 1 day, and then over a period of days, the forgetting would sort of become equal over a period of days and it would level off. So what he really did, if you want to really understand the experiment in terms of how he experimented this on himself, so he would primarily work all by himself, and when he tried to retrieve this list after learning, he understood that after the first 20 minutes he could remember almost 60% of the list, but after 2 days he could not remember even less than 50%. So forgetting is learning is also very high in the first few minutes, but forgetting also can become very quick in the first hour. But then forgetting slowly continues at a very slow rate over a period of days. Now let's look at the relearning aspect. Okay, and when he relearned these 7 lists of unrelated items, again he did this with himself. It took him, obviously it took him fewer trials, it took him lesser time, because he's relearning the same lists again than original learning. So he learned these 7 lists, and he waited to make 2 errorless repetitions, because he just didn't want to, like sort of understand that this has happened accidentally. I've reproduced a correct list accidentally, so he wanted to reproduce a list without errors twice. So he did it twice, and after relearning he waited for 20 minutes, then he waited for 1 hour, then 9 hours, then 1 day, 2 days, 6 days, 31 days after learning every list. And what he realized is what time he took for initial learning was much lesser this time. Also, the number of errors he made was much lesser this time. So that's the last point which is given here. The amount of time and the number of trials to relearn are much lesser. But what did he learn, and how did he plot the curve of forgetting? Which brings us to the last point on this PPT. He said that memory of newly learnt material drops down considerably in days or weeks unless it is reviewed, used, or rehearsed. So if you have to understand this first pointer on the screen, look at the 2 conclusions that he plotted on a graph. He said that forgetting occurs very quickly, as quickly as learning can occur. So if in this moment I give you a list of 10 words to learn, not spellings, but to learn them in order, you will be able to reproduce that in order in the very next minute after you have learned for 10 minutes. In the 11th minute you will be able to reproduce it. But what will happen within the first hour? Within that first hour, if I ask you after 40-45 minutes again reproduce it, forgetting will be maximum. You will probably be able to remember very few words. Then again you relearn over a period of time, and you realize that your forgetting levels off. It keeps reducing over a period of time unless you relearn. So if you look at this diagram over here, you look at the y-axis. Okay, so after 20%, let's put a 0 over there down next to 1 on the x-axis, and let's say that 0.1, let's say that is the area where you probably learned and you were able to reproduce the list completely at 100%. So can you see 100% on top? The light green line is at 100%. But as hours go by and you reach the first day, everything on the x-axis is in the form of days. As you reach the first day, you see the amount of forgetting that has occurred. It's from 100% to almost 50%. So you've actually forgotten 50% of the material that you've learned. That's a lot of forgetting. And that's the first conclusion, that forgetting occurs very quickly after learning. But then you see on the second day, again considerable drop up to say 35%, and then on the third day around 22, 25%, and on the fourth day a little less than 20%, and then you see that there is not much difference in how much you're forgetting. It's sort of what you remember on the 5th, 6th and 7th day could have very minor differences. So that's the second conclusion, that over a period of time your amount of forgetting will sort of level off. It will gradually reduce, and then you will probably remember, if you remember like 6 words on the 5th day, maybe on the 6th and the 7th day you'll remember 4 to 5 words, but you will still remember parts, but very less parts of it. So that is how he studied forgetting, and he realized that forgetting happens very quickly after learning, but eventually over a period of time forgetting levels off unless you relearn and bring everything back into use, and you use that information again and again. So I really hope I have done justice to this topic of forgetting, and memory. I would strongly recommend that you go through these videos at least twice, not just for the assessment or the assignment. I don't know what I'm going to plan, but definitely something to test you on in terms of how much you've understood. But go through this because these concepts, this chapter is a little difficult, even if you compare it to other concepts under the cognitive psychology spectrum. Memory is one of the difficult topics to sort of understand, because memories don't really, for us, they don't really exist, but they're very much there physically in your brain. And also, if you want to really get a beautiful understanding, like I said in my previous video, watch the movie Inside Out. It's wonderful, right? And I hope a lot of concepts I have been able to sort of explain with simple examples. And definitely, if you have any queries, please feel free to call me like you all have been doing, but please not right before the assessment. Definitely call me if you have doubts just for the video as well. And thank you for being attentive. And I hope you enjoy both the videos, and all the best. Thank you.